Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome to the Woo Curious podcast. Your map to the mystical, your key to the sacred, and your guide back home to yourself. I'm Eileen, a writer, a spiritual coach, energy healer, and slow living witch. This podcast is your invitation to explore a world where the mundane and the sacred intertwine. It's a haven for those ready to take the first steps into the realms of magic and mystery, providing a safe space for you to embark on your own enchanted journey towards healing and self-discovery. Here, I'll unveil the whispers of the mystical, the rituals often hidden in plain sight, and I'll engage in sacred conversation intended to stir your soul and lead you back into your power. I'm all about demystifying woo and witchcraft. So, whether you're a seasoned seeker or simply woo curious, I'm so delighted you've decided to join me on this journey. Let's make magic. Hello, and welcome back, Woo Crew, to another episode of the Woo Curious podcast. I am your host, Eileen, and I am joined today by Lottie Moore. Lottie is a Firewalk facilitator and master trainer, an ancestral healing practitioner trainer, and a wild soul guide, helping folks remember land, lineage, and the fire inside. She's joining me from her home in the UK today, and I couldn't be more delighted to have her here on the podcast with us. Welcome, Lottie.
Hi, Eileen. It's so good to be here, actually. Really excited to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you. As I start with all of my guests, as we mentioned before we started recording here, I love to hear about people's journeys, what brought them to the work that they're doing, their journey of woo, as it were, or that spiritual journey.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's start there. Tell me about what brought you into this work that you're doing today.
So it's quite a story. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible, but kind of in the early kind of to mid noughties, really, I think I was quite a broken woman. You know, things had not gone as I thought they would. And so I packed my bags and went to live in Burkina Faso for a year. So for people that don't know, Burkina is a weeny little landlocked country in West Africa. A lot of people have never even heard of it. Went and lived there with my daughter, who turned 10 at the time, out there. We lived often without electricity, without running water in the home. And it was a time of real renewal. But that time I wouldn't really have considered myself spiritual or woo at all. You know, I was just me.
Right.
And then during that time also, which I think is really key to my journey now, looking back on it, I went through my menopause, which was my early 40s, so quite early to be going through that process. But I didn't know the relevance of that at the time. Came back to the UK, wanted to do something that passed on what I'd learned from particularly the women in Africa, particularly the women of Faso, but didn't really know what that looked like. Had no idea what coaching was or sitting in circle was or any of this stuff. So two things happened. I lost my job almost immediately when I got back. Got a job, lost the job. Got taken under the wing of a guy that was starting a charity to raise money to build schools in Burkina Faso. So started doing some project management for them. So project manage a Kilimanjaro trek for them. And trained as a life coach. And still at that time, nothing really spiritual going on for me.
Right.
And then I met the mountains, and the mountains just created something in me that started to grow. I started to run mountain trek retreats for women to the highest point of North Africa, so Toubkal in the Atlas Mountains. And I feel that as I walked through the mountains, and I walked and I hiked and I hiked and I walked, I was walking something into myself. And I went through kind of like a remembering process. Somebody said to me, if you like taking people out of their comfort zone, you should think about firewalking. So I went and trained as a firewalk instructor. But even at that time, the training that I did, it wasn't a very good training. It was very like Tony Robbins, push harder, kind of training. And And I thought there's got to be more to this than that. There's got to be a better way of doing this. And so I went off and worked with lots of different Firewalk masters around the world, supporting them, working for them, working with them. And the fire really created something within me. And here I am, 12, 13 years later. I have done trainings. I missed out a lot of the early trainings. I went straight to train Firewalk instructors.
Right.
I did a couple of really basic shamanic courses and then went straight in at advanced shamanic training.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of what I've gone through, I feel, has been a remembering process.
Yeah, I love that you brought us back to that word, because I circled it when I was introducing you. I love the hyphen in it, the remembering. There's that sense of that return to something that was a part of us, and that like that member piece, right? Like a limb almost, and a reconnection to it.
Definitely. For me, two things. For me, for what I do in my work, I know that I have done this before.
Mm-hmm.
Ancestrally, I do a lot of my teaching in Ireland, spend a lot of time in Ireland. My dad was Irish, my ancestors were Irish. And I feel a lot of what I teach and do now, I have remembered through that ancestral lineage.
Right.
I've had some very woo experiences through all of that. But also, I couldn't find a teacher. When I started on my journey, and I put things in a couple of Facebook groups from like retreat centers where I'd done some courses, or places where I'd learned with people, and said, oh, when I walk on the land, this happens. The land talks to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm journeying in the middle world. If you have any kind of shamanic experience, so I didn't know it was journeying in the middle world at the time, but
mm-hmm.
I'm going into trance-like state and doing healing work while I'm walking on the land.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't find a teacher.
So
and a lot of what I teach now, I do because that's what I needed.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a common thread for people too in the healing world. Often we become what it is we needed most.
Yeah.
And I'll tie back to that, the way that it's almost as though your spirituality found you. And I think that's something that's really common as well when I speak to people. It's this sense of, a lot of us had a sense of connection to something more enchanted in our lives when we were young. There was that magic that was just part of being a child. And so many of us lost it. And then it really is this, as you were telling your story, finding those synchronicities and looking backwards of, somebody was like, well, why don't you do Firewalk training? Because if you want to get people out of their comfort zone, that's a great place to go. And at the time, you probably wouldn't have had the term synchronicity handy to use for what that is. But yeah, that return to spirituality and listening to the call of your bones.
Definitely. Bones is the exact word. It's in our bones. And even the site I use in Ireland to hold my trainings in West Islands, it's a beautiful site where we stay in like hobbit holes and similar kind of huts. Really magical, very quirky. But there's a fairy fort up on the hill above it, a ring fort.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had some really profound woo experiences up in the fairy fort. I'm pretty sure that it's somewhere where the unbaptized children were buried. And I think it's probably where the unchurched women went to have their babies. I feel there that I have a very, very strong ancestral connection there. But I had no idea of that when I found myself there, the first time.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting experience. I am thinking, as you're speaking, of the first and only at this point time that I went to Ireland was just a few years back, and I was just was I coming up to the end of my year-long energy healers training program with Nadine, who is a friend to both of us.
Yeah.
And I remember stepping out of the airport. Even it was like we were in the car, exhausted, overnight flight, and I just remember being so enchanted and like that sense of, oh, this is home. Like there is a line straight back here for me. And the only other place I think I felt that but did not have the language or the understanding because it was too long ago was in the Highlands of Scotland, where again it was just like, oh, this is
Yeah.
my people's place. And that's my lineage is primarily Scottish and Irish. When I trace it back, almost all of
Yeah.
my ancestors are from
Same
those two
here. All
places.
Celts. Yeah. I have a little bit of Wales, but again, it's that
Mm,
Celtic Cardiff kind of region of Wales.
yeah.
So I'm like 98% Celt, even though I'm London born and bred.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that speaks a little bit too to the displacement or disconnection, which is where that remembering is so important, that so many of us have from the lands of our ancestors in our
Yeah.
modern culture. And especially most of my listeners are here in North America with me. We are so detached from where we come from that it creates dis-ease in us, right? That like feeling of
Yeah.
not belonging or not being connected to our place. And I think it's something so important to develop that connection to land, to place. And that can happen in a new place. It doesn't mean you have to go back to your ancestral lands, but it's an interesting piece that
Yeah.
I've been just mulling over in my mind for how to bring forward more.
I feel at the moment that Ireland is like calling her people home.
Hmm.
I have students come from all over the world. Some people coming out of the US for the first time in their lives, and some really rooted in very strong spiritual practice. I've got one woman coming to train with me in September, and she's Navajo. She's coming to train with me, and she can remember pictures of her grandmother on the wall firewalking. She believes she's one of the
Oh,
last in a
wow.
lineage as Navajo firewalkers. And yet she's coming to Ireland to learn because Ireland is calling, that vibration of the land.
Right. There's something there, something magic happening.
Yeah,
I love that. I
yeah,
remember you saying that to me that Ireland is calling her people home. I've heard you say that before and it really resonated because that's how it
yeah,
felt. And it still feels now that I've been once. I'm always thinking about it. And anytime I see a picture or hear a reference, it's like, oh, how do we get there? And can
yeah.
I handle the weather once we're there for long periods of time?
Every bit of weather in one day in Ireland, isn't it? For every
Yeah.
bit of weather in one day.
Yeah, not actually all that different to where I'm at. I grew up in Canmore, which is the mountains just west of Calgary. And
Ah,
even in Calgary, the saying is, if you don't like the weather, wait 15 minutes.
Hey, Woo Crew. I just wanted to let you know about the summer healing special that I am running. For the months of July, August, and September, I am offering support in the form of remote healing packages. So this looks like bi-weekly remote energy healings and readings with voice note support in between. Really the perfect way to receive healing and guidance through those busy summer months when maybe you don't have time to add another appointment to your calendar. You choose the day of the week, I drop into your energy while you go about your day, and I send over the guidance that I receive from your guides and the healing work that I do, along with any tools or homework that may be useful to you on your journey by voice note. In addition, you get voice note support in between these sessions for the entire month, and you can sign up for 1 month, for 2, or for all 3. If you are interested in jumping into this, I've left the link to hop on in below, but you can also come on over to Instagram at I am Eileen March or send me an email, Eileen@myluminouslife. I've left a link below as well for a 30-minute free coffee chat to discuss whether this offer is a fit for you.
I'm really curious. Lately, you've been talking in your social media a lot more about ushering or shepherding the dead home or, sitting with the souls of the dead. I would love for you to speak
yeah.
to that a little more because I'm so curious.
It's been a journey I've been on for several months, really, I would say, of like spending time with the dead, which is sounds really bizarre and quite morbid and everything, but that hasn't been my experience. It's kind of a 2 or 3 prong thing. So I need to touch on like 2 or 3 different aspects of what I've been doing to cover it fully. One is that I train ancestral healing practitioners. So I have a course, Healing Land, Healing Lineage, which is training practitioners to work with ancestors, about that way, to heal lineage, going that way, and to do that by working on the land. So spending a lot of time with the ancestors and talking about ancestors and working with other people that are working with the ancestors. And of course, they're the dead. And kind of this cycle, Eileen, this cycle of how the ancestors nourish the land. You know, if we go back, rather than thinking, when we talk about ancestors, people often think of their grandparents or something like that.
Right.
But if we start going back, we have hundreds of ancestors. So the ancestors quite literally nourish the land. They're buried in the land. They nourish the land. The land then nourishes the plants, the trees. Plants and the trees then nourish the animals and us. And so it creates this cycle. So part of my walk with the dead has been walking with the ancestors, both quite recent ancestors and going back further. It's funny, when I did a course on death and dying in Scotland and learning Psychopomp, which will be the next thing I'll talk about a bit more. But on that course, we had to visit the place of the dead. So journeying into the place of the dead to meet with somebody that we wanted to meet. And it was quite a packed course. There were like loads of people on the course. But afterwards, we went round circle and everybody was sharing their story. And everybody else in the circle was saying, oh, well, I met with my auntie who died of cancer, or I met my dad who died 5 years ago. So everybody else had met somebody that they'd known in the living. Whereas I never knew either of my grandfathers. Both of them passed over before I was born. I met with my grandfather and he taught me how to prepare a rabbit skin.
Oh, interesting.
And it's so interesting for me because even now, if you see my social media, I've had a few kind of full bird wings come to me recently.
Yeah.
And I've been preparing the wings to work with to make smudge fans. Even I have a red kite wing actually from the other day. But the preparation I'm doing on the skin of the wing is what my granddad taught me, who I never met in real life.
Yeah.
So all of this coming up with the dead. The second thing, my relationship with the dead, is the Psychopomp. And so if you don't know what Psychopomp is, it's like a shamanic process that helps people move from the place of the living to the place of the dead.
Right.
In very simple terms. And I've been doing that a lot with animals. So I live in a very rural area. There's always like roadkill left on the roads. So I've been tending to the dead in that way and just working with them, doing ceremony, doing rituals. What a brutal, awful way to die.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been seeing that in your stories and your posts, and that's what I was thinking. I drove past a deer. I think it was a deer in the ditch the other day. There was a crow sitting on it. And as I drove past, I thought of you because I was like, I have no idea what I would do if I pulled over, but I sent out just a little bit of like, rest, peaceful, rest easy as I drove past. It was a highway. Absolutely. It wasn't really a great place to pull over, but yeah, it's so fascinating and curious. And it really just feels like right and tender. I was reading this morning in one of Sharon Blackie's books, the enchantment one. Anyways, she's speaking about, that disconnection that we have from the natural world, and like, I'm going to use man quite purposefully, the disconnect between man and nature, and man and the world that happened, 1,000 years ago or so in Western philosophy. And so this reconnecting, and, if you saw a person on the side of the road that had been hit by a car, you would never just drive by, no matter whether they were alive or dead. You would pull over.
Yeah.
And so starting to even just acknowledge that disconnect that we have from the preciousness of life, of all life, I think is a really important piece of remembering, there's that word again,
remembering
and
that
re-enchanting.
connection. And just, so if I can, and it's not always possible when you're on the road, but if I can, I'll stop, I'll dress the body with a few flowers, maybe the eyes with flowers. I'll gift just a pinch of herb, have some hawthorn tincture. I might leave some drops of hawthorn tincture, great heart medicine.
Right.
And just sing a song. Just to show some gratitude in some way. So even the red kite wings I've got from last weekend, somebody else had hit that red kite with their car and left it in the middle of the road.
Right.
And it's, so I stopped just to move her to the verge so she wasn't in the middle of the road, and I could feel she was still warm.
Right.
So in the back of my car she went. And
Yeah.
I drove and did what I was doing, and then when I came home, with her permission of course, I've removed her wings and prepared those to be able to use for smudge fans, for the medicine to move forward. So it creates this circle, doesn't it? The ancestors nourish the land nourishes these plants, everything that nourish these animals, that then come to give us healing. We can use aspects of them for medicine. So there's that aspect of working with the dead. And I've also been really fascinated with grief recently. So I've just finished some grief support training. I've got another course I'm going to do as well, because I always feel the need to be overqualified. I don't know about anybody else.
Welcome to the club.
But I'm going to start teaching grief rituals.
I love that.
I feel that we're shit at mourning and grieving.
You really are. Yeah.
In Ireland, they talk about it much more. They've got it much more, the weeping and the wailing. So I'm going to start teaching others to hold grief rituals. So that aspect of the dead. And so it's not always about death of a person or an animal, though quite often it is, a pet or a relative or something like that. But I feel that the COVID and the lockdowns has created a lot of grief in people, and we're seeing it coming out now in different aspects.
Yeah. It's a fascinating topic.
Yeah. Grieving losing a job, grieving missing out on a university, grieving, that removal from friends and others that we had at that time, grieving people that we lost during COVID, and maybe you couldn't have many people at the funeral. You didn't grieve in the way that you would have.
Yeah, grieving of those imagined futures. I was writing about that recently. Yeah. I'm writing a book about rest, and it feels more like I'm writing a book about grief. Because
we should talk then.
I think one of the things that happens when we do finally, if we're able to slow down and actually take real rest, is that all the griefs that we haven't been able to grieve can bubble up. And so that's part of what makes it feel a bit scary or overwhelming sometimes, is one facet of rest that can be intimidating for people. But this cultural disconnection, again, from grief and the grieving process and the discomfort that so many people have, they don't know how to hold grief for themselves or for others. And we have this very linear thinking that, runs through all of our culture, linear progress, linear time, linear everything. And so this gets applied to grief, which is just not linear. We think, it's been 6 months, you should be over it by now. And that's anybody who's had real grief in their life knows that that's just not how it works. It comes in waves. Some days it's strong, some days it's gentle, but it's never linear.
And it's recognizing it as what it is. But both the Irish culture and the Burkina culture, so from where I lived in Burkina Faso, the Burkina grief rituals are amazing. So bringing some of that in, and the death, whether it's a death of a part of you, and it's the same when we go through these. I don't like the term, but it's the term people use, spiritual awakenings, right? When we discover our woo and we step into it, there's often a grieving further down the line of, the friends that you lost, or the aspects of the personality that you've had to
Let
put to
go
death,
of.
you know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which we say, oh, this is great, and we have to do this, and I'm going into the shadow, and I'm going to do, you know, and then a few years down the line, it's like, whoa.
That actually is just making me think about a conversation I had. I think the episode that actually aired last week, if I'm correct, thinking way into the future here, but about the idea of cyclicality and cyclical living, and the fall being the time that we can shed those things, and then that necessity of a winter for those pieces of us to compost and give way to new life come spring. And it makes it feel, again, coming back into the land, it's like those pieces of us, while they weren't serving anymore, they're still serving in some ways. They're like our little personal little bits of our ancestor body, almost giving way to allow for new growth.
Yeah, definitely. And all those aspects of what have brought us to what we are today and where we are today, you know. The place where I work in Ireland is a key example of that. So I ended up going there. My initial going there was doing it with one other guy, and we were sticking two fingers up at two people that had mucked us around. And at the time, that really hurt. You know, they had mucked us around. There'd been money taken from a business bank account. You know, all this type of thing. It was a hurtful experience that people that I'd loved and trusted and everything else had.
Right.
And yet that led me to be where I was. So all those aspects of ourselves that we shared and let go of and grieve over. Yeah, it needs that recognition, it needs that grief.
Yeah.
Otherwise it just goes stagnant
and stale. And almost sometimes, like, I'm just thinking about, when we think about shedding, I think a lot of people in the spiritual world will be like, oh, we're releasing, we're shedding. And I think what gets lost there is the reincorporating, or the composting piece. It's like, we're not just severing a limb and leaving it by the side of the proverbial road and carrying on without it. It's still there. There's a memory of it in ourselves. And so to acknowledge the grief process, and that way being able to incorporate it and move on with it, still giving the nourishment to whatever it is we're becoming. I think it's just a much gentler and natural way of that spiritual awakening or growth piece. Yeah,
totally. And I don't know about you, Eileen, but like when I was growing up and when I was in my slightly younger adult years, when I thought of spirituality, this was not the stuff I thought.
No.
I just wanted a nice crystal to put on the shelf, or
right,
love and light, Om Shanti kind of idea. That's not what it's all about, right?
Yeah. It's interesting. That actually reminds me, I wrote down, when you started speaking about this process of working with the dead and grief, how it can sound kind of bizarre, and morbid was the word. And it's so interesting because the deeper we go into these aspects, the more it's so far from morbid. It is so natural. It's that other end of the life spectrum. Birth is similarly masked in kind of fear or secrecy often. And there's nothing more natural than birth and then death. And it's such a shame that they're so hidden in our culture. And so people like you who are walking with it and bringing it out into the light again, I think it's just such an important work that you're doing.
Yeah, and it gives the idea of being morbid, but actually it's a barrel of laughs. Because the dead just don't give a shit. I think the same as maybe particularly women that get to a certain age, whether the menopause or that, that kind of mark, is like you just get to a point where you don't care anymore about what people think, or this kind of idea. If you're lucky, anyway, you do. It's a journey, I guess. But also, we see. I don't like how we call everybody a shaman nowadays, whatever culture, whatever area they're from. But it's a phrase that everybody recognizes. So looking at the shaman, they have a wicked sense of humor. But, very sarcastic, very black, dark humor and everything. I think that when you're working with the dead, working with the ancestors, working with death, you've got to be able to bring in all those aspects of joy and laughter and everything else. Yeah.
It's about the wholeness of the experience of life and not just the pieces of it. Yeah.
And however modern science goes, and all this that many people think is, improvement and everything, they're the two aspects, aren't they, that we all have to go through. As you said, the birth and the death, it's the one thing that we all have in common, is that those two processes.
Oh, it's something just landed for me that perhaps that's why there is some fear around it in some cultures, because to admit that commonality would mean to see the truly human, but also just life piece in every being. And if we acknowledge the humanity or the soul in another being, then it becomes really hard to exploit them callously, which is what our culture demands to keep going.
Yeah.
This point of tension.
And I think also the role of women in the birthing, and it's, we live in societies that are set up to devalue women.
Yeah.
And the boys haven't sussed that one out yet, have they? So let's just pretend it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I feel like it's shifting. There is change in that sphere, but it's slow and it's hard work for sure. I think that's part of what called me to midwifery when I was holding that space, was this, even though at that time I was still calling myself an atheist and a rational scientist and all that, I think that there was still that sense of this is sacred. I would not have used those words, like sacred or holy would not have been in my vocabulary at that point, really. But that's what it was, that feeling of this must be protected and this should be happening in the safety of home, surrounded by other caring women. Like the ideas of, the aunties and the sisters all being present for a birth just resonated with me as like, it was, again, one of those like in my bones, like this is the way it should be. And the same sense for me when I think around death, we need to not be isolated and alone, and so many people end up that way. And then you spoke to COVID, it made that even more kind of isolating when people couldn't come together for even the small ceremonies that we do have in our culture of like a funeral, and these kinds of ways to come together and mourn really left a deep impact that we're just starting to see the effects of.
Totally. The course that I went and did on death and dying, so as well as teaching the Psychopomp process, it got us to think about our own deaths and to write about like what would we like to happen at our kind of funeral or whatever. Did we want to work with a death doula as we were getting closer to that point? All these kinds of things that we often don't discuss until it's too late.
Yeah, that's interesting. All I know is I want to be in one of those tree pods.
Do you?
I would love to.
But, write it down, Eileen. This is the thing, we would do, writing it down.
Yeah.
Making sure the person that's going to make the decisions for you once you've passed knows that.
Yeah, I think it's in my will. I'm pretty sure I said that or whatever the most eco-friendly option is. I don't think they'd let me be up in the, the sky burials that some cultures do. I was like, that seems really cool too. Let the birds come eat me, but I don't think that's legal at this point. Perhaps by the time I pass, it will be.
Yeah. We did that with my cat. My cat died earlier this year, and he was a prolific mouser and birder when he was young. You'd come home and there'd be at least one gift on the floor waiting for you. And we have red kites here, which, if you don't know what a red kite is, it's a bit smaller than an eagle, but it's a powerful bird of prey.
Yeah, they look a bit like hawks.
Yeah, but they're bigger.
Bigger. Okay,
They're
cool.
definitely bigger than the hawks we get here. Yeah. So I just took the cat and laid him out in the field for the red
Mm.
kites. I didn't want to bury him. I didn't, to me, that circle of life was him
Uh,
giving back to what he'd taken from. Yeah.
yeah, I love that. That makes a lot of sense. And nice to be out in the country where it's a possibility.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely.
I would love for you to speak a little bit about what trainings and teachings and offerings you have coming up, because I know you've got a few and they may or may not be full by the time this is airing, but
Yeah.
for people to be able to connect with you.
Yeah, I have a few things coming up. Always firewalk instructor training. So to me, working with the fire is everything. It's the element we most talk about when it comes to transformation, and yet it's the least worked with.
Right.
So if you fancy a hoo-ha and dance it up to live Irish music on the fire, I have firewalk instructor trainings in Ireland and the US this year. I have a year-long container starting, but not until October. And that is about the remembering. So that is all about working with land and lineage and fire inside. So I have that coming up in October. And I have grief ritualist training coming. I'm not sure when that's coming yet.
But it's coming.
But yeah, so I've got a few different things. But, I love to connect with people. I could talk about this stuff all day long. So they'll find me on Instagram. I think it's wild.soul.tribe.
Yes, I think that is correct.
Yeah, or on Facebook, I'm Lottie Moore, or I think it's Lottie Moore Wild Soul Guide is the Facebook page or whatever. Just come say hi.
Yeah, and I can speak from experience. It's you in the DMs
Yeah,
replying to
it's
things,
always
and
me. I do.
yeah,
I have to say, I have ads running at the moment, and for the ads, I have a Facebook Messenger
like a
thing,
bot
which is not
thing,
me. Yeah,
right?
just 2 or 3 questions because I have a lot of people that I work with that are in the US and Canada. I'm here in the UK. I can't deal with messages at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
So very occasionally you'll get a bot, but you'll know it's the bot and not me.
Right.
And I always jump in afterwards and go, hello.
Hello. Here, yeah. And for
I have
anybody
ideas.
who's curious to work with Lottie, I've had the honor of having worked with you a little bit. I've come to a few of your
Yeah.
free offerings. Your guided journeys are so powerful. And the last one I did, I was down in Argentina, and you took us to a fire. We were to meet an ancestor or somebody, and I remembered,
Yeah.
like, it was one of the more vivid guided journeys I've ever been on, and it's so potent and so simple.
It's so amazing to me to hear that. I had a real block for ages about working online and you can't get the power and the energy going. And consistently the feedback I get is like, woof, and I get WhatsApp messages from people. So yeah, it's always great
Yeah.
to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah, well worth connecting. And your Firewalk and several of your courses actually are on my wish list. I'm working towards being able to jump into one of those things with you. I got to
Yeah.
Firewalk with Nadine recently, who was trained by
I
you.
saw that. Yeah, Nadine is a past student of mine. Her and Trika came. I have a few other instructors in Canada, and then also in the US. I have students all over the US as well. But
yeah,
that to me, that course is like pinch myself. It's like I get paid for this because it's all consistently, I'd say it's one of the best weeks of my life.
oh, lovely. Yeah, the video footage and photos are always like that.
Yeah,
looks like a good time.
Yeah, so yeah, I would always say to people, come Firewalk for a week. It's life-changing.
Yeah, having firewalked one evening, I can attest to the life-changing. It's an incredible experience, for sure.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and for everybody listening, obviously all of the links
to work with Lottie, to find her on social media, will be below in the show notes. And I highly encourage you to check her out, hop on our email list, so you're aware of all the upcoming exciting things. And if you get a chance to join any of her free offerings too, they're a lovely taste of the magic that she has.
Yeah, definitely.
So thank you so very much, Lottie, for being here with me today, for sharing a little bit of your wisdom. I do think we could probably have spoken for 3 hours, but I'm so thankful that you reached out and that you're here with me today.
It's been really good. I've really enjoyed it, actually. As you say, we could talk for hours.
Yeah, yay. And Woo Crew, once again, thank you so much for listening. Be sure to connect with Lottie. All the info's in the show notes below. If you liked this episode, please go ahead and rate and review it and share it with your friends. It helps so much to get this podcast discovered by more listeners like you. We will see you all, well, hear you all. You'll hear me next week, same time. Bye for now.